All right, so hi friends. Once again, I'm PS Berge. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of Central Florida, which sits on the traditional territories of the Miccosukee and Seminole peoples. And today I'm going to present to y'all an ongoing project, There Is No Escape, Roguelike Romance and Queer Discovery in the Video Game Hades. So a quick overview of Hades and our protagonist, Zagreus, for the unfamiliar. Hades by Supergiant Games came out in 2020. It's a Game of the Year award-winning hack and slash dungeon crawler video game with dating simulator elements in which Prince Zagreus, son of the titular Hades, repeatedly attempts to escape the underworld, defying his father and locate his mother, Persephone. My argument today is that Hades extends conversations about queer play and the popular genre of the roguelike, opening the possibility for transformation and queer rediscovery. But before we get into that, I want to talk about the genre of the roguelike. A roguelike is a game in which you are expected to die often and repeatedly, and Hades as a roguelike makes use of a permadeath feature. When Zagreus is killed, he is carried on the rivers of blood back to the House of Hades and must begin another escape attempt. I also need to quickly distinguish between roguelikes, in which all progress is lost between runs, and roguelites, with a T, in which there is some kind of retention. Hades is technically a roguelite because there are some items that you retain. Now, most scholarship on roguelikes concern their difficulty. Because gameplay is repetitive and punishing, roguelikes are often fetishized by gamer dude bros for their hardness. And Amanda Cody actually lumps roguelikes in with what she terms masochore games that center masculine dominance. But that is not the whole picture. Queer and feminist game scholars like Bo Ruberg and Stephanie C. Jennings have encouraged us to rethink bad feels and failure in games and even extreme difficulty, exploring our procedural relationships with failure. Likewise, Jordan Wood has discussed how The Binding of Isaac as a roguelike evokes queer play by making space for endless temporal and spatial configurations in its generated dungeons. But Hades complicates roguelites' associations with hegemonic cis masculinity and toxic geek culture by pushing further the possibility for queer and trans play across several layers. But okay, let me start by saying that Hades is a queer game, and I mean this in the most surface level and overt sense. The game is super gay and likes to play with gender stuff, so I'm going to speed run a couple of the highlights here. For one, Zagreus is bi, and over the course of the game, you can date several of the bosses, including the Fury Megara and our emo goth Prince of Death, Thanatos, or both at once, as fan artists are quick to remind us. There is a side quest in which you can reunite and rekindle the bond between Achilles and his lover Patroclus. This is an overtly queer telling of an implied gay relationship in Greek mythos. This is also the case for the game's representations of our true bros, Asterion and Theseus, two bosses in the game and perhaps one of the gayest things to happen to video games. Again, this canonizes an often overlooked queer presence in Greek mythos. We also have an aromantic, asexual character, Dusa, who befriends Zagreus and kindly rebuffs him if he attempts to woo her. And even the Lernian Bone Hydra, one of the bosses, spawns in several colorful configurations, and one of them is subtly the colors of the trans pride flag. And then finally, there is my own personal source of gender envy, a non-binary character called Chaos, who exists in their own void outside of the binary of the Olympic and Chthonic pantheons. So Hades is a quote unquote queer game. It features what I and Stenros and Savonin have called cues that say, hey, we have queer and gender non-conforming characters. Cool. But that is just paint, and we can go farther. So to do that, I want to transplay Hades. And here is what that doesn't mean. I am not trying to convince you that Zagreus is actually a canonically trans character based on my secret findings or whatever. Instead, I want to show you how Zagreus and Hades as a roguelike center transformation and rediscovery in such a way that it opens the proverbial hell gates to trans play and trans players. How am I going to do that? Well, to start, I am going to get a little weepy on main, and so sorry in advance. I happen to play Hades, which is fundamentally a game about repeatedly confronting an abusive parent shortly after coming out to and subsequently becoming estranged from my own transphobic father. So please know that my reading of Hades here is contextualized by my own experience as a non-binary and trans feminine player, still very much in the stages of exploration and rediscovery. And if you are thinking to yourself right now that being trans and playing video games isn't scholarship, I'm going to give you 3 seconds to screen cap this friendly reminder. Thank you. Okay, so structurally, I am going to follow this across 3 crucial areas in the game, beginning with Zagreus's body and then moving on to consider the game's evolving textual dungeon and its framing of difficulty and hardness. So to start, I want to look at Zagreus's body as a shifting archive. Hades, like the Binding of Isaac, emphasizes Zagreus's body as a site of transformation and discovery. In this way, Zagreus is not just overtly bisexual, but is characterized by an embodied fluidity within the world and the narrative. So to return to Jordan Wood's analysis of Isaac, at the end of his piece, Wood points to Isaac's body as a queer bodily archive. As he writes, amid these rather queer temporalities stand the game's centerpiece, Isaac's body. Naked from the outset and armed with only his tears, Isaac only gains power through highly visible, grotesque alterations to his corporeality. It is his very queerness, his constant bodily becoming, which grants Isaac the abilities that set him apart from the monsters throughout the game and enables him to navigate the nightmarish world in which he finds himself. Hades pushes this idea even further as Zagreus tries to navigate his space between the pantheon of the chthonic or underworld gods where he was raised and the pantheon of the Olympic gods that he is now discovering. It is a very gendered tension. And during each run, Zagreus is gifted boons by the Olympic gods that wildly reshape the attacks and moves that Zagreus can do. Now, these boons boost Zagreus's talents, but they also reshape his gestures, animations, and attacks in a way that is rooted in his body and how he moves through the world. For example, Poseidon's boons tend to knock enemies away with watery blasts, while Aphrodite's can charm enemies and send hearts flying. I'll also mention that this openness to transformation applies to Zagreus's weapons, which are described as living infernal arms with minds of their own that reveal new forms over time. I think there's actually a connection to be made there to other queer games like Boyfriend Dungeon, where there are transforming and dateable weapons with personality, but we'll save that for Twitter chatter later. But this is also reflected, and sorry for the pun, in the Mirror of Night. Before going out on a run, Zagreus can reflect in the mirror and spend darkness to boost his abilities. But as the game continues, the mirror shifts, and Zagreus can begin choosing from chthonic talents and a separate set of Olympian skills that replace the chthonic ones. And this opens this interesting gendered interpretation of Zagreus's body as a shifting archive and site of fluid transformation and possibility. Zagreus sets out each run after choosing how he wants to expressively embody these 2 opposed cultural poles. But what's of particular interest to me is how this capacity for transformation is embodied by Zagreus and his weapons. During runs, Zagreus can upgrade and even purge the boons he's collected at blood fountains. And this was something I definitely noticed as I, as a trans feminine person, also actively monitor my own blood to track hormones and body changes. And so I resonated with Zagreus's readiness to purge certain God-given boons and enhance other ones. So Zagreus is characterized by this embodied fluidity, and later in the game, Achilles suggests to Zag that he might actually be the god of blood. And in this way, Zagreus's defining trait is not only his queerness, as in his defiance of the normative, but his liquidity between forms and aspects, boons and talents. Zagreus performs the operations that Misha Cardenas has called the cut and the stitch, and this is what makes Zagreus a powerful vessel for transplay, at what's supplementing and purging his body. But we can still go farther. I want to point out that Hades' emergent narrative systems mean that, unlike Isaac, the underworld and its inhabitants react to Zagreus' shifting and are themselves transformed by it. Through repetition and failed encounters, Zagreus' relationship to the underworld and its bosses are recontextualized by refamiliarity. While Wood points to the procedural randomization of the physical dungeon, I want to explore rediscovery in the context of the game's textual dungeon, the landscape of emergent dialogue and events. Hades begins with little backstory, and you don't know why Zagreus is running. Your first image of Zag is as a punky rebel runaway. He's like sassing his parent and making life hell or more hell for people in the house. And in the early game, Zagreus is called out by his father for being insolent, selfish, uncaring, and disobedient. He's told by others that he's making an unwise choice, putting himself in danger, neglecting his duties, or further aggravating his father. Now, Zagreus's misalignment with the norms of the house are clarified in two ways. On the one hand, his body is different. Zagreus's bleeding is something that separates him from the other chthonic gods. But actually, I think the more pertinent example comes during one of the game's flashback sequences. We learn that Zagreus was once tasked with working in his father's administration chamber, helping oversee the bureaucracy of the underworld, a panoptic system for surveilling and punishing the shades of hell. Incidentally, Zagreus is both bad at and unwilling to help his father in these tasks and is barred from the chamber. In this sense, it is actually Zagreus's refusal to participate in the rearticulation of Hades' hegemonic system of punishment and surveillance that likewise makes Zagreus an outsider. But of course, Zagreus is anything but selfish. He is constantly helping others reconcile their own relationships. But you don't get this right away, because the narrative in Hades, which pulls from the visual novel and dating simulator genres, unfolds by losing. Each time the player dies, they have a chance to talk to and give gifts to the residents of the House of Hades, and between talking to them in the house and battling them out in the underworld, their relationships evolve. The first example we see of this is with Megara the Fury, an officer of Hades and Zagreus's ex. In their first battles, Meg is furious with Zag and refuses to listen while he struggles to explain himself. But after repeated confrontations, Meg reveals she's worried about Zagreus, afraid of how Hades' wrath will escalate, and overwhelmed by her tenuous relationship with her sisters. Through dozens of encounters, their dynamic evolves extensively, and eventually Zag and Meg warm back up to each other, and she even becomes a supportive confidant. Though she always remains the first boss of the game, encounters with her take on a very different dynamic.
So, how many times have we been going at it like this, Zagreus? You tired of me yet?
We're both immortals, Meg. We'll be seeing plenty of each other for a while yet. I've come to welcome these occasions.
Then good. Lashing you across the face beats waiting for the opportunity to do so. Come.
Perfect. This doesn't just apply to Meg. Every boss, including Thanatos, Asterius, and Theseus, are recontextualized. Also, I think somebody else's mic is on. If someone could just check, if everyone could just quickly check their mics for me, that'd be awesome. If it's me, I apologize, but anyway. So this isn't just Meg, every boss is recontextualized in this way. Even the Lernian Bone Hydra, after enough fights, gets affectionately nicknamed Lerny, and the game updates its health bar. And so through repetition, life and death battles with Hades' monstrous foes become playful and often kinky bouts with familiar partners. But there is an exception to this, and that is Hades himself. This reframing takes more time. Rather than de-escalating through encounters with Zagreus, Hades becomes more desperate, angry, and entrenched. Hades will taunt Zagreus, demanding to know why he continues in an act of futility. At other points, he insists that he's just trying to protect Zagreus from the cruelty of the world out there. And finally, that Zagreus cannot escape because none of us can. The interactions between Zagreus and Hades were particularly difficult for me because I had heard words like these before, and I reckon I don't have to translate the message represented here for my trans friends in the audience. But Hades' cruelty becomes more unhinged as the game goes on, and the player may begin to feel like the cycle is endless. No matter how often you defeat me, I shall face you here, Hades warns. In fact, whether or not Hades himself is salvageable is one of the key questions of the game. As Zagreus confesses to Meg, what if he's changed? Or is that impossible? No coming back from certain crimes. Ultimately, in order to beat the game, and by that I mean see the credits roll, Zagreus must fight his way to the surface and defeat his father 10 times. Only then does Hades finally allow Zagreus to pass him without a fight. But the reconciliation between Zagreus and Hades is ultimately incomplete, though we do receive an apology. But what I find more interesting than the apology is that this is actually the first time in the entire game that Hades refers to Zagreus by his name, rather than calling him boy or insolent child. And though Hades and Zag are not ultimately reconciled, that recognition of Zagreus does recontextualize their connection. In this way, we might see Hades as a kind of coming out story. For many trans people, coming out is a cyclical process, something revisited again and again, and coming out requires a recontextualization of relationships that can be jarring and uncomfortable. Yet Hades' take on the roguelike shows Zagreus refamiliarizing himself to the people around him with time. But the roguelike's central message is often one about failure and resilience, and it's hard to know what to do with this, especially when we consider that less than half, almost exactly, of all players will actually manage to escape the underworld, and far fewer will beat Hades all 10 times. So I want to throw in one last complication. I want to talk about hardness. And in case you haven't picked up on it yet, the pun here is that while roguelikes are often accused of fetishizing hardness, Hades literally fetishizes hardness, relying on a dynamic relationship with difficulty and making failure an essential piece of the gameplay loop. Now, I've already talked about how fights with bosses become more playful over time, but there's more to it than that. After the first successful escape attempt, the game introduces the Pact of Punishment, which allows the player to add additional obstacles to their run, like time limits or extra enemy health. Much like the fights between Zag and his colleagues become playful, Hades actually invites the player to participate in consensual punishment by upping the difficulty. But alongside hardness, failure is the hallmark of the roguelike. And I've already talked about how repeated death and loss is crucial to learning the story of the game. But in Hades, even failed runs matter. Leaning into its roguelite mechanics, every run gives the player gems to make hell a little more comfortable, or ambrosia to build their bonds with friends, or darkness to grow in their power. By reframing defeat in this way, even failure is salvaged. Failed runs still improve Zagreus and the player's position, and the lives of everyone in the house. And failure advances the story. Even for players who never clear an escape, every run means progress. So to wrap up here, through repetition, Hades leverages the roguelite to frame a coming out story through Zagreus's literal coming out of hell. Through Transplay, I've shown that as the player re-explores the body of the avatar, the physical and textual landscapes of the underworld, and their relationship to failure, they are engaged in a constant re-seeing, recontextualizing, and rediscovery of the shifting possibilities across body, space, and narrative. Looking forward, I'm planning to explore this in the future alongside other dungeon crawlers that center transformation and rediscovery. And I see the roguelike as a really fruitful space for examining transplay, perhaps in part because I see my own transition as a kind of roguelike. And to be fair, I do live in the actual pits of Tartarus, and by that I mean the state of Florida, which is currently run by a hate gargling dick swab. But that's not the note I want to end on. I actually want to end on a personal note, and that is that at midnight tonight, my parents are actually flying into Orlando, and I am supposed to go pick them up from the airport in a few hours. I have been told by my mother that for the first time since my coming out, my father has agreed to use my name and pronouns. And although I am not expecting much, because I have been in this fight a dozen times already, if Hades and transplaying the roguelike has taught me anything, I think it is that the next run will be at once both harder and easier than the last. Thank you all so much. I am going to leave this slide up for like 2 seconds and then